What if I told you that Atlantic Starr was never really meant to be the success story we all know? Sure, they gave us hits like Secret Lovers and Always, but behind those smooth ballads was a tale of betrayal, infighting, and a record label that dropped them at the peak of their career. They could have been a supergroup, so why didn't they make it? The truth is, their rise to fame was anything but glamorous. Forget the music, the real drama was behind the scenes. Stay tuned, because the untold story of Atlantic Starr isn't as sweet as their love songs. When most people think of Atlantic Starr, they picture a band that had it all: smooth harmonies, catchy love songs, and a string of hits that should have catapulted them into supergroup status. After all, they were one of the most consistent soul bands of the 80s and early 90s. But here's the thing, they were never quite the golden boys of the music industry that we remember. From the start, they were plagued by problems that most fans never saw coming. The misconception that Atlantic Starr was just another polished R&B group that breezed through the charts with no real struggle. But behind the scenes, things were messy. The band's success wasn't a simple story of hard work and good fortune. It was a constant battle, especially when it came to managing the egos of its members. Their sound was constantly shifting, and just when it seemed like they were about to hit the mainstream in a major way, something would break. Why didn't Atlantic Starr reach the status of a true supergroup like Kool and the Gang or Earth, Wind and Fire? It wasn't for lack of talent, believe me. The Lewis brothers, Wayne and David, were undeniably gifted songwriters and musicians. But as we'll see, the band was always at odds over who should have the spotlight. And even when they did achieve success, it was often tainted by internal conflicts and poor management decisions. So, what was it that kept them from reaching the top? A lot of it had to do with their constant struggle with record labels, money issues, and constant lineup changes. While the public adored them, the cracks behind the scenes were already starting to show, and that's where the real story begins. Here's the deal. Atlantic Starr wasn't just unlucky. They were actively set up to fail by a combination of bad management, internal strife, and record label incompetence. And it wasn't just one or two bad breaks. It was a pattern that haunted the band throughout their career. Let's start with their label drama. A&M Records had high hopes for them early on, but things quickly turned sour. After a promising debut, their second album underperformed, leading to the label's decision to change producers. Wait, what? After their first disappointing album? That's a red flag right there. Instead of building on the momentum, A&M swapped out their creative team, and as you can guess, it wasn't exactly smooth sailing from there. But here's the kicker. The same pattern continued throughout their career. Every time they had a little success, the label would yank the rug out from under them. And then came the infamous decision to drop them. Atlantic Starr was gearing up for what could have been their big breakout moment with Secret Lovers, a track that had the potential to take them all the way to the top. But the label wasn't even interested in pushing it. The band had to promote the song on their own and make their own music video. Can you believe that? The track had already been out for a year, but the label thought it wasn't worth the investment. And guess what? It turned into one of their biggest hits. The fact that Secret Lovers became a smash hit without any label support shows just how much potential the band had, and just how bad A&M was at managing them. But it didn't end there. When Atlantic Starr finally hit #1 on the pop charts with All in the Name of Love, they were at the height of their career, but their success was bittersweet. They were dropped by A&M and snatched up by Warner Brothers, which seemed like a win at first. But what did they get in return? More tension, internal fighting, creative differences, and even financial mismanagement. The band was being sabotaged by the very system that was supposed to help them rise. The band's later years were a constant struggle to regain the magic they once had. They cycled through multiple vocalists, each time hoping that the new face would fill the void left by the last. But it was never enough. And as the years went on, Atlantic Starr became a shadow of what they could have been. Talented, but always on the edge of greatness, never fully realizing their potential. So, was Atlantic Starr set up to fail? You bet. Between a rotating lineup, mismanaged finances, and a record label that didn't believe in them when they needed it most, Atlantic Starr's story is the perfect example of a band that could have been massive, but was held back at every turn. Now, let's dig a little deeper. It wasn't just about record labels and bad luck. It was the mismanagement of money and escalating tension between the members that truly derailed Atlantic Starr's potential. The band may have had chart-topping hits, but behind the scenes, It was a hot mess. Take Barbara Weathers, for example. She was a key part of their success, contributing powerhouse vocals that helped elevate their sound. But what happened? She found herself broke despite being on a major tour. How does that even happen? She was informed by the band's manager that her account was empty after 2 years of successful touring. Can you imagine the shock? It turns out the band's finances were a mess, and no one really knew what was going on behind the scenes. So what did Barbara do? She hired an accountant, and guess what? She discovered that the money she'd earned from her time with the band had been mishandled. She confronted the group about it, but of course, no one believed her. The financial disaster was just one piece of the puzzle. You'd think a band with chart toppers would be living large, but nope. The Lewis brothers, Wayne and David, were the songwriters, the masterminds behind the group's success. But as the group gained fame, they also gained resentment from the other members. The other bandmates started feeling like they were being left out, both creatively and financially. And guess what? They weren't wrong. The Lewis brothers had a lot more control over the band's direction and money than the others, leading to serious tension within the group. This tension boiled over in one of the most dramatic moments of the band's history, the infamous split during the production of their next album. The band broke into two factions, one side led by the Lewis brothers and the other by the rest of the members, including Sharon Bryant. The power struggle was real. Some members even felt that the Lewis brothers were going Hollywood, getting too focused on the fame and fortune that came with their success, leaving the others behind. And don't even get me started on their manager. In one of their most revealing moments, Barbara recalled how she walked away from the band after discovering that their manager had misled her about her finances. She wasn't the only one who felt slighted. There was a growing belief that the band's management had played favorites and mishandled their money, fueling more distrust and resentment within the group. The final straw came when the management refused to stand up for Barbara. That was it. The drama over money, control, and respect led to Barbara leaving the group at the peak of their success, a moment that forever changed the band. So, what does this all mean? Atlantic Starr wasn't just about talent and great songs. It was about a toxic mix of financial mismanagement, egos clashing, and members being treated unfairly. They had the potential to be so much more than they were, but constant infighting and a lack of proper management made sure that success was always just out of reach. And while they did have some seriously amazing tracks, the internal chaos was their ultimate downfall. Let's not forget the family dynamic within Atlantic Starr, because it played a huge role in both their success and their demise. The Lewis brothers, Wayne and David, were the backbone of the band. They wrote the majority of the songs and controlled the creative direction. But here's the thing. When you mix family with a professional band, things get complicated. On the one hand, the brothers were incredibly talented and driven, but on the other, their familial bond led to a disproportionate amount of control over the band's direction, both musically and financially. This caused a serious rift between them and the other members, who felt sidelined and underappreciated. The tension really started to boil over in the 80s, when the rest of the band began to feel that Wayne and David were using their power to write all the music, taking the lion's share of credit, and most importantly, the money. As the band's popularity grew, so did the creative differences. It became clear that the Lewis brothers were calling the shots, and not everyone was happy about it. Sharon Bryant, who was the lead vocalist and a huge part of the band's sound, found herself caught in the middle. She was brought in to add some balance to the band's dynamic, but when the creative tension started ramping up, she was put in an impossible position. She spoke about the heartbreak of being caught between the brothers and the rest of the group, who felt increasingly alienated from the creative process. The other members started questioning why the songwriting credits were always going to the Lewis brothers and why the money wasn't being shared more equally. This created a toxic atmosphere where everyone started feeling like their contributions were undervalued. And then there's the fact that after Sharon left, they replaced her with yet another female vocalist, Barbara Weathers, who was brought in to fill the gaping hole in the group's sound. But here's where the real family drama unfolded. Wayne and Barbara were in a long-term relationship. Talk about workplace tension. The brothers, especially David, weren't exactly thrilled about this, and you can imagine how awkward things got when Barbara's relationship with Wayne began affecting her interactions with the rest of the group. Barbara was already dealing with the financial mismanagement, but her personal issues with the band started to affect her work. The other members were growing resentful of her relationship with Wayne, and it didn't take long for things to escalate. In an explosive backstage confrontation with David, Barbara called out his treatment of her. The screaming match that followed wasn't just a clash of egos, it was the breaking point that sent Barbara packing from the group. But let's not forget that the brothers didn't just lose Barbara, they also lost the unity of the group. As the band continued to cycle through different female vocalists, the dynamic changed once again. The revolving door of members created confusion and instability, and the creative tension continued to rise. The Lewis brothers' need to control the band, coupled with their personal relationships, ultimately drove the group apart. What could have been a harmonious partnership between the siblings and their bandmates quickly turned into a tug-of-war for control, leaving the band fractured and disillusioned. In the end, Atlantic Starr's downfall wasn't just about bad management or external forces. It was the result of a family dynamic that led to creative and personal conflicts. The band had talent, but the internal issues were always too much to overcome. Now, let's talk about Secret Lovers. The song that changed everything for Atlantic Starr, yet was also a reminder of just how mismanaged their career had been. This song should not have worked. Let me break it down for you. It was released from an album that had already been out for a year, with no real label support behind it. A year! That's a lifetime in the music industry. Not to mention, it was a ballad, a slow jam, when the band had been known for their upbeat funk and dance tracks. But here's the thing, it became a massive hit. Here's where it gets interesting. Atlantic Starr had to take matters into their own hands. Their label, A&M, wasn't interested in pushing the song, so they decided to close their set with it on tour, giving it a prime spot at the end of every performance. The result? Pure magic. As the song gained momentum, people started buzzing about it, and just like that, it exploded on the charts, becoming one of their biggest hits, landing in the top 5 on both the R&B and pop charts. But this success was bittersweet. The song that revived their career was also a testament to everything that was wrong with the band's management. Instead of capitalizing on it, the label ignored it at first, and the band had to fight to make it work. They made their own music video with limited resources. You know, the one with the DIY homemade look? And still, the song became a hit. Imagine how much bigger it could have been with proper label backing. But at least this victory proved that Atlantic Starr had the potential to be massive, even if no one was truly helping them reach that peak. But this wasn't their true breakout moment. The next chapter was supposed to be even bigger, and it came with the album All in the Name of Love in 1987. This was the record that should have solidified them as one of the best groups of the era, and it almost did. The lead single, All in the Name of Love, went all the way to #1 on both the R&B and pop charts, which was huge for them. For the first time, Atlantic Starr had officially crossed over into the mainstream in a way they had always dreamed of. But the euphoria of success didn't last long. Here's where the cracks started showing. While the band was riding high on the commercial success of their biggest single, personal issues were lurking just below the surface. The tension between Wayne and David and the other band members was nearly unbearable. The brothers were still in control of the band's direction, but the other members felt increasingly sidelined. Barbara Weathers, the lead vocalist, was especially affected by the rising animosity. It became clear that her relationship with Wayne wasn't sitting well with the rest of the group, especially David, and this tension culminated in one of the most dramatic departures in the band's history. Barbara left at the height of their success, which not only stripped them of their sound, but also shattered the remaining unity in the band. The band's final moments on their peak were marked by betrayal and unresolved conflict. By the time their next album, Yours Forever, dropped in 1983, the damage had already been done. They were struggling with a new sound, new vocalists, and worst of all, a broken identity. Despite achieving a top 5 hit with Touch of 4-Leaf Clover, it wasn't enough to maintain their place in the spotlight. The public was starting to lose interest. More lineup changes followed, but the magic was gone. Their final record with A&M in 1986 proved to be their last shot at regaining their former glory, but the band was dropped mid-tour. Despite some successes with their 1987 album All in the Name of Love and new attempts with different members, the constant cycle of changes, family drama, and internal battles ultimately sealed their fate. Atlantic Starr's true potential was never fully realized, and their story became a what could have been tragedy. The rise of Secret Lovers was proof that Atlantic Starr had the chops, but they were always fighting against more than just the charts. They were battling each other, their management, and their own fractured vision. In the end, they were never able to sustain their success, and their final album proved that, despite all their talent, they were always a step behind where they should have been. By the time the 1990s rolled in, Atlantic Starr was already well on their way to becoming a shadow of what they once were. And it wasn't just about losing Barbara Weathers or getting dropped by labels. The real downfall started with the band's internal instability. Endless lineup changes, shifting dynamics, and personal struggles that kept pulling them in different directions. Let's start with the personal battles that many of the band members were facing. Wayne and David, the Lewis brothers, were still the driving forces behind the band, but as time went on, their personal lives started interfering with their professional ones. Wayne was in a long-term relationship with Barbara Weathers, and as the tensions between them and the rest of the band grew, so did the strain on their relationship. But it wasn't just about the relationship issues. There was a growing sense of disillusionment, not just with the group's creative direction, but with the whole music industry itself. David Lewis was the first to make a huge decision that would change the band's trajectory for good. In the early 90s, he decided to leave Atlantic Starr for spiritual reasons. After marrying and becoming more involved in his faith, David felt that being a part of the band wasn't aligning with his personal values anymore. Imagine that, leaving the band just when they were about to reclaim some glory with hits like Masterpiece. It wasn't just a creative decision, it was a life-changing one. But here's the thing. David wasn't the only one grappling with personal issues. The constant member changes took a toll on the band's cohesion. New faces were constantly brought in to fill the void, but no one could quite replace the chemistry that had once existed. In 1991, they introduced a new female vocalist, Rachel Oliver, hoping she'd be the one to bring fresh life into the group. But even with a strong new voice, the magic was gone. The band couldn't recapture the success they once had, and their next album, Love Crazy, despite charting with 2 big songs, failed to push them back into the spotlight. The band's struggles weren't just musical, they were deeply personal. From financial mismanagement to disputes over songwriting credits, they couldn't catch a break. By the time they signed with Arista in 1994, the band was barely recognizable. The lineup had shifted so many times that they had lost track of who they even were. The new members couldn't bring the same spark, and the success of the 80s felt like a distant memory. Atlantic Starr's last official album in 1994, Time, barely made a dent in the charts. It didn't even come close to matching their earlier hits. The problem wasn't just that they were dealing with a different sound. It was that the band's identity had completely fragmented over the years. The members who had been with the group from the start were no longer invested, and those who replaced them could never fill their shoes. The cycle of change had drained them of the cohesion they once had, leaving a shell of what could have been a musical dynasty. But even after all that, Atlantic Starr wasn't ready to call it quits. In the late 90s, they tried to reinvent themselves one last time, releasing All Because of You, 1998, and Legacy, 1999, bringing in yet another new singer, Aisha Tanner, to replace Rachel Oliver. But nothing stuck. The band had lost their original sound, and with each lineup change, their ability to capture the public's attention waned. By the time the group released Metamorphosis in 2017, featuring entirely new members like Leon E.P.s and Melissa Pierce, it was clear that Atlantic Starr was more of a brand than a band at that point. The Lewis brothers were the only original members still involved, and while they continued to tour, the essence of what made Atlantic Starr special was long gone. Their story is a perfect example of how personal struggles and ever-changing lineups can completely derail a band's career. The group that once created timeless classics was now just a shadow of itself, stuck in a revolving door of members and left fighting for a relevance they could never quite hold on to. So, where does that leave Atlantic Starr? A band that had all the potential in the world, yet was constantly sabotaged by its own internal struggles, financial mismanagement, and never-ending lineup changes. From the peak of their success with hits like Secret Lovers and Always, to the heartbreaking departures and creative wars that ultimately split the group apart, their journey is a testament to what can go wrong when talent and opportunity collide with bad management and personal demons. In 2025, Atlantic Starr is still out there, touring under the name, with Wayne and Jonathan Lewis as the only original members left. The group is still performing, but the magic of their 80s heyday is long gone. The band will always be remembered for their smooth sound, but their story is one of what could have been. The hits, the drama, the mismanagement, it's all part of the legacy now. Atlantic Starr didn't just fail to be a supergroup, they were actively kept from ever reaching that potential. So next time you hear one of their classics, remember, it wasn't just about the music. It was about the battle behind the scenes. Atlantic Starr's legacy may be locked in the past, but the story of their rise, fall, and what ifs will live on in the hearts of those who still remember the real story behind the band.